Hey everybody, and welcome to episode number 6 of the Glenn Hallam podcast. It is a pleasure as always to have you along, taking the time to listen to my stories. Thank you very much. It's been quite the week in the UK. We're currently coming out of what essentially was the third lockdown due to the pandemic. And it's quite exciting because non-essential shops are starting to open. And that means that schools are now getting back to, or hopefully staying there, getting back to how they were just over 12 months ago. So my phone has been ringing like crazy for me to go back to certain schools that shut down for the year almost. I'm happy. Oh, I'm so happy because life looks like it's going to get back to normal. Let's hope it stays there. Also, it's been quite a special week for me because I celebrated my 54th birthday last weekend, and my family made it very special, even though it was essentially during a lockdown. And you know, it kind of makes you reflect on the years because in my last podcast number 4, I talked about how I described marching my way to success by marching down the Mall. And, you know, that made me think that I wanted to play drums for pretty much the rest of my life. And thankfully, I stuck to it. And here we are today. So I left school at 16 years old. And that is 38 years ago, coming up for next month. And certainly plenty to reflect on. I don't regret nothing. I think I've had an amazing life, that's for sure. But, you know, leaving school at 16 was a really tough thing to do. I'd done my exams. I didn't do very well. It was okay. I got enough to get a job. And when we were 16 back in 1983, the biggest priority for us to do when we left school was to get a job. That was the only thing we looked at. And I mean, it was a different time then. And to be fair, you could. There was more jobs available. So when I left school, I went into the motor trade, and it wasn't really by choice. It was just you'd looking the local paper and see a job advertised, and you think, well, I could do that. And so joining the motor trade, I was recruited it was kind of like a Motor Factors. We sold spares to the trade. So obviously if the garage needed some spares, they would phone up this supplier, and you would arrange the order and send it out to them. Now, I had quite a few years there, actually, and enjoyed it. I was kind of always into cars, although at that particular point I couldn't drive. But I like cars. I had the odd poster on the wall in my bedroom of a super Ferrari or something. And I kind of dreamt of driving, and motorcycles was another thing that I kind of was into at that time, and desperate to be able to get some kind of driving license where I could be independent and go wherever I wanted to. But of course, I had to get a job to be able to finance that. And I did, and I worked, and I bought my first motorcycle, which was a little 50cc Suzuki. In fact, the reason that came about is because a lot of my friends were turning 16 whilst we were still at school, and would have these little kind of moped motorcycles, and it was cool to have one. And so, but I did get into the bikes. I did have one when I could play. I forget how much it cost me, but it was a hire purchase thing from my first job. So I got that. I got a job, and I was selling spares, but underneath all of that, I still wanted to join a band. And when I finished school, the friendships that I'd created through the people at the sixth form block, it kind of disappeared, because once you left school, you kind of on your own, and it was a new world, and quite daunting, but it was a new world, and you had to make that happen. And the reality of me becoming an adult, really, and making my own choices, which would later then shape the way my life would go, was a lot of pressure, So I'm working at the motor trade, and I'm thinking, God, I'm earning my money. It wasn't a lot then, but it was money in my pocket. And I thought, well, I need to find a band. Now, much like most counties across the UK, I would imagine you had your local paper, and ours in Northamptonshire, well, in Kettering and Corby area, was the Evening Telegraph. And this was back in the days where you had the actual paper and you would go to the local sort of store and pick up the paper, and especially like on a Wednesday night, it might be property night. On a Thursday, it would be job night. And that's where actually I originally came across the advert for the job that I was currently doing. But in the small columns, they would often have local bands advertising for musicians that they wanted. And this was great because I found drummer wanted. So I answered the advert. And it was I forget how the advert was worded, but they wanted a drummer. So I gave them a call, no emails then. I gave them a call and said, I'm interested in playing drums, but I'm 16 years old. And it turned out that the people that put the advert in the paper were in their 40s. All right, so they were a lot older than me. But I think the truth of it is they'd tried to find a drummer their age and it wasn't possible. So in the end, they'd probably gone through all those kind of people and decided that, oh, well, there's this young lad, he's 16, shall we give him a try? And so I think I was the last on the list. So they phoned me back and said, right, I want you to meet us in this club. And it was a working men's club that was in Burton Latimer. And I did. And gee, that was scary. I remember walking for the first time as a 16-year-old lad into a working men's club. You can picture it. That there's there are a bunch of guys in the corner playing cards. There's a bunch of guys playing pool or snooker or something. Real smoky old place, because that's what we did back then. And so I sat in the corner, and of course I didn't even know who these guys were. I didn't know what they looked like, but I was there, and I was there on time, and so nobody came up to me. So I went to the bar, got a Coke, as you did, and sat in the corner and just waited for somebody to come up to me and say, are you Glenn Hallam? And well, thankfully, what seemed a lifetime, I sat there waiting, but they did come up to me. They walked in the club and say, you Glenn, and came and sat with me. Now, what happened there was, back to what I was saying, I think I was the last on the list. So I quite liked them. They were quite funny. And they went and got their beer, and I'm sitting there with my Coke. And so we started to organise a rehearsal. And it was actually going to be in the upstairs of the very same club we were sitting in. And that, so I forget, it was kind of a midweek night or something. So we arranged this practice, and I hadn't got a lot of gear at the time because my father was really supportive of my playing, and he'd managed to get me kind of a 200 Beverley drum kit, which was a small place in the UK that made drum sets. I think they originally sold to Premier or something like that. I could be corrected on that. But anyway, I had this drum set. It was back in the days when for you to be able to get credit to buy anything, there was a thing called Provident. And I think it was, I was very young to understand it, but I think it was a case of they would give you like this book, and it would to be of the value of whatever you chose the credit agreement to be. And my father actually brought me this drum kit. We went to Leicester to go and get it with one of these checks. And he gave out this money. He'd signed this check, and obviously the shop took it. And then there was a guy that come round every Friday to take part payment of it. And that's how we got my first drum kit. And he was never a guy that was in debt or anything. He always paid his bills. We just didn't have much money. And, I'm quite flattered all these years later to think that he actually worked quite hard, because £200 then was a lot of money. It still is now, but it was a lot of money. And he did this, and we went to get the drum kit. And thankfully, I'd got that ready for this practice. I think he was always going to buy me a drum kit because I'd, been through my school years playing, so I couldn't use the school kit anymore, I'd left. So I turned up to this rehearsal, and I'd got a lift at the time because obviously couldn't get there. It wasn't my father, it was a friend of my father's actually, I think. But so we started playing in the upstairs of this club, and I was amazed. So the lineup of the band was like guitarist, bass player, another rhythm guitarist, and a guy that turned out to be a brother of the guitarist, who was singing. And the kind of music that they did was like, status quo stuff. It was rock stuff. It was Free, All Right Now, and that sort of thing. So a lot of the back end of the 60s, kind of sort of punchy rock. And we started playing, and they were like, wow, they think this guy can play. He's only 16, but he knows all these songs. Truth being told, I didn't. I was just able to work out the music form of these songs and recognized how they went, and kind of by listening to them, I kind of knew the changes and stuff. And I didn't get everything right, but I kind of played it sort of, as if I was listening to the records back home. And there's a learning curve there, because I think a lot of the things that I was able to do on that very night was because I'd sat and listened to records when I was a younger guy, and left at home at home during the school holidays, and I would listen to my dad's records and all them Elvis records that I would listen to. But also, ultimately, I think I've got to thank the guy that I hung out with in the sixth form block at school, because in my last podcast, I mentioned that he worked in a record shop, so he would often bring the records back and stuff that I hadn't heard, and I would just listen. I'd literally wear the records out. So, I'd recognized a lot of things, and I was starting to get better. I was a show-off, though. So, when I teach students now, you don't want to overplay. It's all about the groove. It's all about the music. But I wasn't. I didn't care about anything like that. I was in a band. I was in a band out of school. I was in an adult band that had the potential for me doing real shows. And that's where I got really excited. And anyway, to cut long story short, I landed up being their drummer. Now, they lived in Burton Latimer, and they were in the process, crazily enough, of buying a bar. And they purchased this bar and opened this business together. And of course, that inevitably gave us another area to practice. It was quite a nice bar, if I remember. I can't remember the name. And so we would use that as our rehearsal. The rhythm guitarist, as with the other guys, would drive, but he would say, well, I tell you what, I'll pick you up. And unfortunately, he got the job of, picking the drummer up. And obviously, he would come to my father's house, pick me up, we'd load all the drums in, and then we would go to the rehearsal, and he would take me back. And I'm eternally grateful for that, because I was too young to even, start driving. Although in a very, few months' time, I was going to start anyway, because I was due to turn 17. So this practice started really, it started going good, and this started leading to gigs, and the gigs started coming in. So I was playing working men's clubs and things like that, and the odd pub, and it was like I was living the dream. And unfortunately, I don't say unfortunately, because I've never had a problem with it, but then I discovered alcohol because I was hanging out with older people. So we started drinking beer, and I was kind of sucked into that kind of whole thing. I mean, like I said, I never had a problem with it, but it was kind of, I'm 16, 17, and I'm thinking, right, I've got to get into this. Do I drink beer? I don't want to be laughed at. And, before you know it, you're drinking pints of beer whilst playing. I'm still not driving now, so I could. But thankfully, I was, I kept it under control. And but I'd often get drunk at a gig and kind of show off a little bit, and I cringe to think about it. Even to this day. But again, it was kind of, I was going into that world. So it was good experience for me to discover what I should do and what I shouldn't do early on. So that was how I started playing out of school. Now, I was still with that band. And then, give it a few months, these guys turn around and say, okay, we're going to Spain next week. And I thought, Spain? Now, remember, I'm 17 years old, never been to another country. I'm not even sure I could have told you where Spain were. And so Spain. I said, what are you going to Spain for? He said, we're going to go over there and we're going to book some gigs. And I said, okay. I said, we're going to play in Spain. And he said, well, that's the idea. So, okay. So, all right, that happened. They come back, the pair of them come back 2 weeks later and said, we've got a week in August. 2 weeks, sorry. 2 weeks in August playing in Spain. And I'm thinking, I'm going on tour. I'm going on tour. I'm not only going on tour, I'm going to another country. Now, in my previous podcast, I said that I always got excited going to London. So you can imagine what I felt like. I'm going to Spain. I'm going on an aeroplane. So that was quite cool. And anyway, that did come off. And so it's getting near the time that we're going to go. We're going to do 2 weeks, and we're pretty full. There's a load of shows going on. And so I have to get myself a passport. And it was back in the days where you used to get the year passport and it was just the paper thing. So I had to get one of those. And so I did. And I remember going to the airport and I just didn't know what it was. Well, I knew it was an airport, but it was just like, what's happening? I get on the plane. I'm right at the back of the plane. Everybody's smoking. As soon as the seatbelt sign goes off, everybody lights up a cigarette in the back of the plane. It's like a smog, but it was what you did then, and we land in Spain. Now, okay, we land in Spain, but our equipment is not there because one of the other guys was driving it over in an old ambulance. Now, we land in Spain and the accommodation is booked and, we land at Girona Airport. But it's quite late in the evening and we get word, how? Because we didn't have any mobile phones. I think somebody had messaged somewhere or other. I can't remember what happened. We get word that the van's broken down in France. Now, we can't get to our accommodation until the next day. And so I slept with the rest of the band on the floor at Girona Airport. I'm still living the dream, believe it or not. And we sat on the floor. I don't think I got much sleep. But anyway, by the morning, we wake up and we kind of have to make our way to the accommodation. Well, I don't know whether you've ever thought about this, but being that I never been to another country, I stepped outside of the airport and I'm still in my jumper and jeans or whatever I've got on at the time. And the sun was out and it was quite early in the morning. So I didn't realize how hot it could be in another country. And so we just walk. I don't know where we're walking. We're walking to the accommodation somewhere, or we're trying to find a way to get to it. The sun gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and I think I'm going to die. I take my jumper off. I drag a t-shirt out of my case, and the concrete is hotter than anything I'd ever experienced. I really thought I was in the desert. And that was oh my, are we going to play in this? This is incredible. I was asking loads of questions. Is it always like this? I was British and never been to another country. I thought it was going to rain. It did it. No, not at all. I thought I was thousands and thousands of miles away then. I thought I was on the other side of the world. And and that was quite an experience. And we went and done them shows. We did. It was hard. It was a country bar that we played in quite a lot. Well, at the time, I said that we were doing the status quo things and the rock things, but we'd also started doing some Eagle stuff like Lion Eyes and that for the country kind of bar. And, this bar was beautiful. It was a big place, and we got friendly with the people that ran it, and we played every night. But what I didn't account for is the fact that during the day, the older people would say, come on, we're going down the beach. And we'd have our wives with us, by the way. And by this point, and of course, they always wanted to go and see things. And I'm not suggesting anything, by the way, but they would always go and want to see or go down to the beach. Now, to this day, I am not a beach lover, but we did because, I'm 17 years old and I'll do whatever, So we lie on the beach. Who gets sunstroke? I do. Absolutely. I am sort of red raw. I had no idea the strength of the sun, like I said. And so I got really bad sunstroke. And of course, we got a show that night. And of course, I'm trying to be an adult, so I'm drinking as well. I'm drinking beer during the day, and it's a recipe for disaster. And I'm I'm not going to play. I can't. It turns out there's an old fella in the audience who played drums. He landed up doing one of these nights because I was so rough. I laugh about it now. It was quite embarrassing at the time, but so we did the shows. They loved us, and then we flew home, and then I was expecting to come back, and everybody had heard about us, and there was going to be a reception of some sort at the airport, and of course there was not. And I felt like a pop star. I felt like now I was getting somewhere. I'd played in another country. I'd not only played in another country, I had been to another country. So I was I'd gone up in my own estimation. It was a good experience for me. I love it. I still talk about it now. I probably exaggerate a little bit, but it was kind of a put together, thrown together thing. But that happened. So there you go. And I've still got the bug for that now. So all these years on, but I think what it did was give me that experience and met people. I met some English people. I first came across people that couldn't speak English and trying to communicate, being a little bit embarrassed going into a shop to want to buy something, and I can't because, I could, but I couldn't make myself understood. And so that experience was a bit of a life-changing thing, really, because I had no idea up until that point that anywhere else in the world existed. So that was good, and that broadened my horizons hugely, and I think it changed the way I felt about the world. It really did. It was a big influence on me. Now I got this newfound confidence, and so when we got back, we're still in the band, and we do carry on doing the clubs and stuff like that, and you can imagine the poster, can't you? Recently back from Spain. We discovered that locally in Kettering there was a pub, and this pub was called the King's Arms. And at that time, I was 17 years old. I could do what I wanted to do, and I'd started driving by then, and it didn't take me long to do my test. I was still working in the motor trade, so that was a big help with that, because I was reversing vans in and stuff like that. So I went and did my driving test and kind of passed first time, and so all of a sudden I was driving. So we could discover certain pubs around this area. Now, I've spoken about Corby a lot because they had a lot of jam sessions over here, because I'm in Weldon in Northamptonshire. But Kettering I was born in Kettering, and there was one pub called the King's Arms. And I discovered this via these two guys in the band. And they would take me, and you could go to this pub on a Tuesday evening, and there'd be somebody playing. It might have been a thrown together band, because they'd wait for the bigger bands on a Saturday or Friday or Saturday or Sunday, a thrown together thing. But you started to see a different world. Now I'd left school. Now these were other guys playing on stage live in front of people, and man, they were good. And you realise that all of a sudden you better do some work, because you need to be as good as these guys. And of course, you went there and you started, you became friends with them. And I would watch this drummer, and I would just say, because if he listens to this, because this, right, okay, so I literally, do you know what? On the tip of my tongue, and I'm going to say it, I fell in love with this guy, right? Not literally hearts and stuff, but I just couldn't stop watching him. There was something about him, his playing, the way it felt. It was like, oh my gosh, this guy is incredible. Now, his name, and this is all I'm going to say, his nickname was Flute. Now, Flute was, in my eyes, after seeing him and going, he's my hero totally, I was obsessed with him. Sorry, Flute, if you're listening. If I was obsessed with him. And it was purely because of his talent. But the guys he were playing with, there was rumours, there was another guy that I'm not going to mention because he's no longer with us, and I didn't know very well, but he'd got an EMI record deal. He was in this band. I'm not even going to mention the band, because if you're local you would know, but it was like, I looked up and thought, he's got an EMI record deal. He's the first guy I'm ever going to speak to that has that kind of deal. So he was a big deal in this pub, but I was obsessed with the drummer. He was a great vocalist, by the way, and he was a really nice guy as well. So he was an amazing voice. And this band blew me away. But we kept on I just couldn't stop going there. And I hadn't built up the courage to speak to the drummer, because he was like, I was down here, and he was way up top, but I still was obsessed with him. I was like, I don't know, it's just like your heroes, you want to say something, but you daren't because you're embarrassed. Well, eventually, as time goes by, we do start talking, and he is the nicest guy in the world, and still is today. And he was just he was genuinely my first drumming hero. And because of that, we got talking. The pub, so go rewind a little bit, when I said about the two blokes that I was playing music with, had this pub in Burton. These guys started coming over to this pub stroke bar thing, because it was a bit of a restaurant as well, over in Burton Latimer during the week for us to jam. So he bought his band, right? And these guys started hanging out with us. And I'm like, wow, this is great. So, of course, inevitably, our equipment is in this bar. Flute, this drummer, we start sitting down together. He starts playing my very cheap drum kit. And we start talking and really getting into the playing. And he starts showing me stuff. And, and we just had this bond. I remember us sitting in the bar, just drinking beer with a pair of sticks on the table, tapping out little patterns. And then I hear stories about he's going to go on that gig, he's going to go on this gig. He was doing a lot abroad at the time. And I was like, wow. But the wow had died down into some kind of, I was getting on with him. This guy was good. And so we struck up this. I mean, even he played my drums once. I remember this, and he played my drums once, and he set them how he wanted to play it, and then I played them afterwards, and I was like, this is the best thing ever had happened. All of a sudden, I could reach everything. I played better thanks to him just setting the drums up better, and that was amazing. So that relationship built and built and built, and it's quite ironic, really, because he turned out to be the drummer of quite a successful rock and roll band. Now, I was listening to my early Elvis stuff, and I then started going to see him in this band. And so he was a big influence of the rock and roll, the rockabilly, that kind of scene. Although I was still listening to it, to meet somebody that I got on really well with, for him to play, and I could play with him, it was amazing. So he was a massive influence as far as the genre of music I was going to get into and lead into. But he would then say to me, come round my house, and then we'd practice, and he'd teach you a few things or whatever. But so when they were doing that, this King's Arms, the pub, was still happening during around this, so I'd go and see him. And then in the end, he couldn't make a gig down at the King's Arms, and this is a big deal, this place. And he said, do you want to do the gig? And I said, what, Debt for You? And he said, yeah. And I went and played with a bunch of named people that used to be in there. I'm avoiding naming it because I don't like name dropping, but people that had hit records, and I was sitting on the stage with them. And it was hard. It took me a while. I really had to up my game. And of course, then it happened again. And then, Flute turned around and said, right, can you do that show? Can you do New Year's Eve? That happened as well. And I'm only living up the road at this particular point, so I can easily come down. And wow, I was there. I was there locally. I was doing it. And then the pub actually then said, can you do Wednesday night, or can you do then? They took over, and rather than cover for Pete was out the country or something, and I would do it. I just said his name, haven't I? Well, why not? Everybody local knows him anyway. I was trying to avoid that. I would then land up doing that gig, and the greatest thing about that is that it was just the experience of it. And one of the greatest things is he's still around today, and we talk on Facebook every now and again. And for sure, on my podcast here, I would like to interview him. Now, I will, and I'm sure he will, because he's the nicest guy in the world. Just to wrap that story up, to give you an idea how much of a hero and how much of a influence he had on me, is that one of my students, an older student, he's actually in his 60s, came to my studio a few months back, and he was selling a guitar amp. He played guitar as well. And the guy that turned up to buy this amplifier turned round to my student and said, oh, why don't you want your amp no more? And he said, oh, I've been playing drums for about 4 or 5 years. And he says, oh, do you have a teacher? And he said, yeah. He said, I've got Glenn Hallam. And he said, are you kidding? You've got Glenn Hallam as your teacher? He said, he was one of the best drummers in Northamptonshire, along with Flute. And I got compared with Flute as two of the most proficient drummers in Northamptonshire. And that just, even all these years on, his name crops up again. And I got compared as the same as him. That is not true. There's no way I'm even near his level. But to think that somebody compared me and him as, two of the most kind of great drummers in Northamptonshire. That's not true, because there's a few other people I could actually put on that list for sure. But flattered, over the moon. And so here we are all these years later, and it still crops up. So I love that guy to death for what he did to my life. I don't think I've ever told him. I will tell you another story. I think it was 2013, I did a clinic tour with a guy called Paul Hose and Rob Hirons. Rob Hirons runs a teaching school out in Marseille in France. He was coming over, and we put a drum clinic tour over for, it was only 3 nights, but we did it, where did we do it? We did it up north somewhere and in Nottingham, and then I did one in Kettering. Because that's where I was from, obviously. Did it in a school theatre. So we advertise tickets like you do. And so what we do, for those that don't know, in a drum clinic, the drummer basically goes through what he does. And this kind of a masterclass. You know, I do this, I do that. This is why that influenced me, blah, blah, this, that, and the other. And I was pretty much on fire, to be fair. At that point, I'd done all my Canadian stuff and my American stuff and played around a bit. So I was pretty much on form. And I was really confident until that night, Pete, I've now told you his name, Flute, walked in the audience. And I've got to sit there and play and describe what I play and explain my influences and why, and just basically entertain a bunch of drummers. And he's sitting in the audience. And not only does he sit there quietly, he asks me questions. And I was confident until he walked in. I was really nervous. And after the show, we had a quick chat and a hug and sort of said, I can't believe you're here, you know. And he actually turned around and said, your playing's amazing. And, you know, and I'm tingling now, honestly, the guy, you know, it's just for that compliment to come from that guy. Now, you know, I guess the moral of the story is you never know who you're going to, you know, who your heroes are going to be. You know, we look at those people that are in the limelight and we kind of randomly turn around and say, oh, he's my hero or he's my inspiration, and you've probably never spoken to them. But I mean, that's all. Don't get me wrong. I mean, there's media going back from the 30s that we can follow and get inspired by. And in fact, I would encourage every student to actually be curious and find that out. But to actually have known that person and for actually to be inspired so much by him was an incredible experience, and will stay with me for pretty much most of my life, I guess. And if I post this on Facebook, because his brother's on there as well, and they're all going to probably be laughing at me. But you know, so your heroes can come from the strangest of places and can actually set you up for life. And also, so make sure you talk to them if you can. Right, I'll leave that story there. Hopefully I can get him so I can interview him. And he can tell you some of the stories from the other side, I guess. And yeah, he's a special guy, and I have a lot to thank for him. So thank you for listening to my short story. I will actually talk about further on beyond that band after that, because I did get into the rock and roll. And I did manage to travel, and I met another important person in my life who then took me abroad and played with the band. But I'll tell you about that next time. So I hope you've enjoyed my little story, and I will catch you in another episode. And like I said before, thank you for listening. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Jitterbop, 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 we're gonna rock a jitterbop, 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 we're gonna rock and sheep a jitterbop, baby, jitterbop, jitterbop.